no resting place for the wicked. Nearly 3 weeks after Tamerlan Tsarnaev died, the Boston bombing suspect remains lodged in a funeral home in Worcester, Massachusetts, unburied. It has fallen upon Worcester to look for a gravesite, and so far they have faced constant rejection, often without explanation. Police Chief Gary Jemmy said it's a drain on the community.
The police department is expending resources that could be used for other needs in our community. Beyond this, there is a need to do the right thing. We are not barbarians. We bury the dead.
And people around the country, good people, have indeed been offering private grave sites. But the New York Daily News says the family wants a local grave and a Muslim burial, and that's going to be tough, because the local Muslim community has understandably distanced itself from Tsarnaev since the very beginning, and Islamic law may discourage imams from praying over someone who committed this particular type of atrocity. So, what is to be done with the remains of this person? Well, joining me now are two of my favorite theological thinkers in America, Reverend Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite, professor of theology and former president at Chicago Theological Seminary, and author of Interfaith, My Interfaith, Just Peacemaking, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Perspectives on the New Paradigm of Peace and War, and Harris Zafar, national spokesman with the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA. It's a pleasure to have you both here with me tonight.
Evening, John.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks for asking me.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to have you both for such a difficult and painful and controversial topic. Let me begin with you, Harris. If Mr. Tsarnaev really did commit these bombings, is there a place for him in a Muslim cemetery?
Well, John, this is certainly a very sensitive issue, and by no means would I nor any Muslim stand up for the actions that he has allegedly committed. But if we do believe in a God, if you believe there's a God, and you are a believer of the God and you honor that God, you also should honor His creation. And that's why our faith says, regardless of the act committed during the lifetime of that person, you still have an obligation to honor the dead. And so the Prophet Muhammad told us that we come from dust and we should return to dust, which is why we should be still buried in the ground. And so there certainly is a place as a creation of God, of our Almighty. There's a place for Him to still have His final resting place, because His soul has moved on. We can't retaliate against Him. It's really an empty shell of this body, and it becomes our obligation to give it its right due of burying it in the ground.
And I think many Christians would agree for the exact reasons you laid out. However, the reality is, and I'll bring you in on this, Reverend Doctor, any cemetery that takes Mr. Tsarnaev is going to be buying itself a lot of hassles and desecrations, to say nothing of the fact that many people won't want to bury their grandma on the same grounds as this man. Does a cemetery, Doctor, have any obligation to take someone who hurts business?
Well, it's important, John, to think about the fact that it's the community response that would make that something that the cemetery would be reluctant to do. And you know, look what happened just when Viewpoint tweeted that we were going to be having this conversation this evening. There was an outpouring of revengeful, negative, angry tweets that you know, are largely unquotable here on such a program.
Welcome to my world.
Yes, exactly. And when communities give in to anger, it's understandable. I mean, the anger is understandable. But when that fuels this kind of community backlash against letting someone be buried, we're not going to be able to move past this anger and actually get to grief.
Right.
And if you don't get to grief, you don't feel the pain. And communities need to actually feel the pain in order to be able to come together.
And so
I'm concerned about the very fact, as you're pointing out, this is absolutely the case, that these communities fear backlash, but they fear backlash. And I think the religious leaders in those communities, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, of all faiths, need to come together and say, this is inappropriate, and this person needs to be allowed to be buried.
Again, it's a prime example of the spiritual concerns up against the commercial concerns. And Harris, we kind of addressed this already, but should an imam pray over someone who's committed this kind of atrocity? Again, the family has had a very difficult time finding someone willing to do it. How much of a Muslim ceremony can be achieved here?
Well, Islamic law is to keep funerals very simple, and so it's to keep it to the utmost simplicity. And the only time in which in Islam it's prescribed not to do a funeral prayer before burying the dead is in a case of a suicide. Because in that event, someone has given up trust in God and decided to play God themselves by taking their own life.
Right.
And so as a form of a protest for what the lack of faith in God, we don't do a funeral prayer, but we still bury the dead. But in this case, he has allegedly, if this is true, then certainly he has committed a very heinous crime that no one's going to try to justify. But the fact remains that he hasn't done anything that, according to the Islamic faith, would prevent him from having a funeral prayer, because even a prayer can be a prayer for forgiveness, that God have mercy on him. But as spiritual beings, we should know that he's in the court of Allah now. So
Right.
he's in the court of God, and that's where his ultimate judgment will be. And desecrating a grave, desecrating his body, or protesting the remains that will eventually become obsolete, serves no purpose of what will happen to him. Of course, we don't want to create any disorder in the land, so we do want to respect people's feelings and emotions. At the same time, we just call people towards human decency. Like the officer said, we're not barbarians.
Harris, can he be...
we don't...
Go ahead, please.
I'll just say, we still owe the right of the dead.
Right. Can he be buried in a non-Muslim cemetery?
Absolutely. The vast majority of Muslims in this country are buried in non-Muslim grave sites. It's a very small number of Muslim communities that actually purchase plots of land for Muslims to be buried in. There's absolutely nothing preventing a Muslim from being buried in a graveyard that's not Muslim.
Doctor, I'm going to give you the last question. What would you say to protesters outside this funeral home and to the people like the ones who tweeted it at the three of us today for talking about this subject, who are angry about the prospect of a burial?
I understand your pain. It's natural to feel pain when violence rips apart your community. But we can't change the past. The only thing we can do is change how we relate to the past. And if you don't put the anger down, that past will control you. You're giving into the violence because you're letting it control you in the present, and it will warp you into the future. Put it down for your own sake, not for the sake of anyone else. Let go, because if you don't, then what happens is the very thing that terrorism tries to do, which is disrupt and disorder communities and make us turn against one another, will succeed.